Hey guys, in this video I want to talk about Experiencing Story, a company that has developed many first-person dungeon crawlers or DRPGs, whatever the term you prefer. So I'll be checking how they started, the general execution in their games, the ones I recommend the most, and some curious things within their stories. Something similar as an iceberg thing, sharing some ideas of how I consider their stories link one another. Without further ado, let's begin. Prior to being named Experiencing, it was another company named Microsoft, company that developed some wizardry games as Wizardry Empire 2, Legacy of the Princess, Princess of the Ancient, Summoner, and the first two Edge games. Unfortunately for them, the company went bankrupt, but this didn't mean the end, as they created Team Muramasa, team that became Experiencing. The first titles from this company were a kind of continuation of Edge games, with Code Hazard, Breaker, and Realize, games that later down the line were turned into Operation Abyss and Babel. The original releases were for PC, and for a small company it could be said that they had a decent success. Time later they would develop another Edge game, Labyrinth Cross Blood. Unfortunately this one hasn't received a kind of remake as Operation Abyss Babel. Down the line, a choice that brought question marks for many was their fifth entry for the 360, as Xbox is not that popular in Japan. Students of the Round, or Entako no Seito, had a similar thematic as the previous games, but this time in a fantasy world named Alda. Students of the Round will see a port to PSP, port that had better reception compared with the previous Edge games. This of course marked a direction of this company, with Demon Gaze, game that hit the right spot back in 2013, turning into a new success for Experiencing, with somewhere around 200,000 units sold. Let's remember that for a non-AAA studio and niche genre, reaching those numbers is quite the feat. In this point, it's worth mentioning that first-person dungeon crawlers were not particularly popular. They existed since the 80s, but Etrian Odyssey and Demon Gaze would begin a new era with anime style, and of course better graphics than the first Wizardry games or Eye of the Beholder. This led to the already mentioned ports of Operation Abyss and Babel, New Tokyo Legacy. As I have already shared in their particular review, these games are not that friendly as other DRPGs, or newer DRPGs to be precise, so you will have a particular feeling as old school ones. That doesn't mean that they should be overlooked, especially Babel. These previous small successes led to also receive Demon Gaze 2 in 2016. Unfortunately, this title didn't steer things as much as the first entry, despite numerous improvements compared with Babel. A bad entry doesn't mean it is another tragic end, because time later they released a new title named Stranger of Sword City, a much harder game compared with the previous entries with a mature style. This game was originally launched for the 360, later ported to Vita as a revisited edition, making it a definitive edition, for several tweaks it received. The next entry will be a kind of experiment attempt with Ray Giant, another DRPG that focused a bit more into a visual novel. This collaboration with Bandai Namco didn't attract that much attention, perhaps reason why we haven't seen ports. However, that previous visual novel probably ignited a fire inside Experiencing as they started experimenting with visual novels. This led to the creation of Spirit Hunter Deathmark, where we follow a man that helps to solve supernatural mysteries in Tokyo. This title got many critical praises due to the kind of setting the devs placed into the game, with tense atmosphere and extraordinary story. However, this small success led to another not so good outcome, and I will say that it is because it is a small company that reuses stuff along the way, and Spirit Hunter NG didn't receive the same critiques as the previous title. Unfortunately, this is something we can quickly catch by looking at their DRPGs, where they reuse enemies a good chunk of time. In 2018, Experiencing released Blue Wing Chevalier, also known as Saviors of Sapphire Wings, the remake of Students of the Round, tweaking the game with new art, customization, and story, making it into the definitive edition. Once again, unfortunately for them, this is another game that didn't steer things up, and not so long ago we received two new games, Undernauts, Labyrinth of Yomi, and Monju, where it is easy to see the foundation of these games. In the following sections, I'll talk about more about these two entries. At this point, I believe it is worth talking about the general execution in their games. When we talk about the RPGs, it is easy to see that they are a really niche genre, which oftentimes are classified as games with no character due to the old roots as Dungeons and Dragons, where the player needs to create the background of each character. In D&D with other friends this brings interesting adventures, but when we talk about solo players this requires good imagination or extraordinary game mechanics, otherwise the idea alone is going to be marked as generic, for the lack of better words. Now add this to a company that has a really limited budget and you will find similar ideas in each release. Take the Edge Games, Demon Gaze, Stranger of Sword City, Undernauts, Monju, and you will notice that they have similar or the same classes one another. Samurais are the ones that can beat the heck out of everyone with moves like Carnage or Shoot Front, depending from the particular entry. This unfortunately leads to kind of similar experiences aside from the narrative and world building in their games. On this front, the games I recommend the most are Operation Babel, Demon Gaze, Stranger of Sword City, and Undernauts. This particular entry is because that is where you will see some of the best aspects of experiencing Operation Babel with old school ideas but not as stupidly unforgiving as really old RPGs. Demon Gaze with some fan service ideas, but definitely solid gameplay mechanics and interesting story. Stranger of Sword City with a much more mature setting that brings a solid story with many puzzles and a cryptic world building. And Undernauts with an extraordinary gameplay that lets you choose when and where to farm, but also a really mature and amazing story that takes a bit of time to bring the best topics, but once it takes inertia, it doesn't stop. I understand that the RPGs may not be of your liking due to the old school ideas that they have, but Undernauts is definitely a must play if you want to have a wider vision of what the RPGs can do if properly set. On this note, I gotta say that Naoki Jimbo, the OST composer, has amazing ideas. If you like Demon Gaze, which is oftentimes considered a banger, most likely you are going to like Stranger of Sword City, which subsequently leads to Operation Abyss Babel, and that completes the circle with Undernauts, with similar compositions as Abyss Babel. At least I will say, check the combat tracks, they are something to behold. And for the last section, the small iceberg of how these stories link one another. I haven't played Microsoft games, so I cannot completely say, but when you start playing Operation Abyss for example, one of the main characters asks if you know about them. This makes me think that in Academy Frontier and Unlimited Students there were references. Otherwise, this question makes not that much sense, because it is once again asked in Operation Babel, game that links Abyss with complete and obvious reason. Following this same logic, if you look at the class of the hero in Saviors of Sapphire Wings, you will see it listed as a variant. Variants in Operation Abyss Babel are not limited to enemies in a way, because Noriko before her reconstruction was a variant, unable to control herself. But with further improvements in technology that we see in Abyss, this could link Abyss and Saviors of Sapphire Wings in a sense, because at the end of the day, they have a coded reality. Now, Students of the Round takes place in a world named Alda. Stranger of Sword City takes place in Alda. The original name of the game was The Stranger in Alda. This makes complete sense when we see the origin of the drug that was produced in Marilith territory. Now, if this makes sense, Demon Gaze also takes place in Alda. This is not hard to notice because one of the portraits showed a particular dragon from Students of the Round in Demon Gaze. Ironically, the Dragon of Neutrality, which takes a big role in this convoluted mess. And when we read through the narrative of Undernauts, this could also lead into a kind of parallel world connected to Alda, despite the gap in years. Some references can be found with the three brothers we confront at the mid of the game, and its post-content. And last but not least, in Monju. While this one feels like it was taken out of the pocket, oftentimes the crossovers can be taken out of the equation, as they were introduced since Labyrinth Cross Blood Infinity. Nonetheless, taking that out of the equation, we get specific names as Merlin from Saviors of Sapphire Wings, and how this vicious cycle has repeated itself in different realities, not particularly limited to Babel with Aelith who belongs to a different dimension. Yeah, this one needed a good puff and maybe reading a bit too much between lines, but once you put everything together, it starts to make sense. And I will say that probably if you wanna see some other interesting games down the line, it would be a good idea to support this small company. I hope you found this video informative. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.